After the collapse of communism in the early 90s, the majority of post-communist countries implemented a goal-oriented state policy to overcome the consequences of the communist totalitarian regime. This policy provided for the dissemination of information on the crimes of communism, various kinds of work on informing and promoting that which really happened in these countries during the communist era. Unfortunately, such a policy was not implemented for a long time in Ukraine. There was no thorough rotation of political elites in Ukraine after the fall of the communist regime, and some of the former ideologists remained in power. Therefore, the first steps towards carrying out decommunization reforms were taken only after the Orange Revolution. One of the key changes was the establishment of the Ukrainian Institute of National Remembrance as a central executive body. KGB archives were opened up, and the whole world learned about one of the most terrible crimes of the communist regime, the Holodomor, which was recognized as genocide of the Ukrainian people. But after political changes, the coming to power of pro-Russian politician Yanukovych, these changes were liquidated, and the Institute of National Remembrance was practically liquidated too. The archives were sealed again, and we know that Yanukovych's humanitarian policy was an imitation of Russian humanitarian policy, which was aimed at return to all things Soviet, and afterwards it resulted in the use of Soviet methods of leadership in modern times. This concerned restriction of freedom of speech and limiting freedom of assembly. There were even political prisoners. As a result, everything ended in mass confrontation, which is now called Euromaidan, or the Revolution of Dignity. Yanukovych's escape from Ukraine provided an opportunity to return to the policy of decommunization. In March 2014, a month after the Revolution of Dignity, I was appointed head of the Ukrainian Institute of National Remembrance. Obviously, my first task was to return the previous status of a central executive authority. We did this, and at that point we were almost ready to begin to put what we had developed, which was founded on studying the experience of other countries in Eastern Europe, into practice. There are such institutions in Poland, Bulgaria, and Germany. In some countries, archive documents are also used to illustrate officials. According to experts, a separate archive of the Institute of National Remembrance has to be established in Ukraine. A feature of this archive is that the documents of Soviet state agencies, the NKVD and the Militia or other security agencies, are currently kept in archives of state bodies that are not even successors. That is, the Security Service of Ukraine is not the successor of the KGB, but people do not know this. Of course, the staff of the institutions often moved from one place to another, but formally they are not successors. A special group called National Memory, where experts held lively discussions not only about ideas, but about draft bills, was established within the framework of the reanimation package of reforms. In April 2015, the first package of draft bills aimed at overcoming the consequences of the communist totalitarian regime was adopted. We have to reveal the archives of totalitarian regimes, that is, of the Nazi regime that was here during World War II, as well as the communist one, and give historians and ordinary people the opportunity to learn what happened and what methods were used by the special services. Thus, Ukraine caught up with most Eastern European countries by introducing the reform of decommunization and using specific instruments to remove the symbolism of the communist totalitarian regime from the public space. In my opinion, Ukraine has already carried out large-scale reform in order to put this law into practice. A total of 987 Ukrainian settlements have been renamed, as have 52,000 toponyms in settlements, that is, streets, squares, lanes. Over 2,500 monuments in honor of leaders of the communist totalitarian regime were dismantled. So Ukraine has finally done those things that had to be done in Ukraine after the fall of communism, and in so doing, to some extent equated itself to other countries of Eastern and Central Europe. The next progressive point is the adoption of the law on access to the archives of repressive bodies. Today the archive is accessible. The problem is that most of the documents failed to survive. Too little evidence about the existence of the repressive machine in the 60s, 70s survived. Some of this evidence was simply taken to Russia in the 90s, and other documents were simply destroyed earlier in the late 1980s. So I consider it is one of the most important steps that we can be proud of, and we've already begun to implement the principles that had been developed in earlier reform on access to public information, because the principles laid out in the Access to Public Information Act have begun to be transposed into this law. It is like a pilot project. Of course, these principles must be applied to the entire archival system, but this is a challenge for the future. Society needs to understand how important this is, because it is one of the elements of state security. The establishment of the Euromaidan Museum is an extremely necessary and difficult part of the reform. There is a project that won the competition, but lively discussions on its implementation still continue to this day. Obviously, the museum must not be some sort of cemetery. For example, it should not exhibit items like pieces of pavement containing traces of blood. That would be wrong. Nevertheless, the Euromaidan Museum is a museum of dignity, which also has to perpetuate these sacrifices, perpetuate those 100 people, the heavenly 100, who gave their lives in order to change something. But at the same time, it should not turn into a place of crying and suffering. We have to move forward, remembering these people and paying tribute to them. Language policy and legislative regulation of the calendar of main public holidays are also one of the main tasks of reform. In this way, large-scale reform of the policy of national memory, which is intended to restore justice and the rights of all victims of the communist totalitarian regime, has already been launched in Ukraine.